Alicia, ¿podrías decir algo para ponerte a cuadro, por favor?
Sí, sí, prueba, prueba. Hola, buenos días. ¿Está bien?
Ok,
Gracias.
adelante.
Muy buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a otra sesión del seminario sobre las emociones y activismo de base y cambio social. En la sesión de hoy se solapan dos eventos. El primero del seminario permanente interinstitucional sobre emociones, activismo y cambio social, y un evento que empieza hoy y terminará el jueves sobre las emociones climáticas, y el evento se llama EmoAcciones. En los dos eventos empezamos con una conferencia magistral. Tenemos esta vez el doctor Panu Pihkala de la Universidad de Helsinki, Finlandia, que nos hablará sobre las emociones climáticas, qué son y cómo nos pueden ayudar a enfrentar la crisis climática. Antes de pasar la palabra a Alice, que nos presentará a nuestro invitado desde Finlandia, damos las gracias al Stage, al Departamento de Audiovisual para apoyarnos y al Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales para su apoyo con la traducción simultánea al español, y obviamente a nuestra traductora favorita, Paula Salinas. Dejo la palabra a Alice, que va a presentar Panu Pihkala, por favor.
Buenos días en México, buenas tardes en Finlandia. El doctor Pihkala, muchísimas personas ya lo conocen. En redes sociales hay carruseles, información sobre sus trabajos. También en español, también aquí en México. Es profesor adjunto de Teología Ambiental en la Universidad de Helsinki, Finlandia. Es un reconocido investigador, experto en la investigación interdisciplinaria sobre ecoansiedad y ecoemociones, y por esa razón estamos muy felices de tenerlo aquí con nosotros en nuestro seminario y en estas jornadas que empiezan hoy. También tiene un podcast sobre cambio climático y felicidad que también mencionó nuestra colega Verly Blanche en la anterior conferencia, y comparte ese podcast con el psicólogo ambiental Tommaso. Y también ha desarrollado métodos prácticos para el trabajo con ecoemociones. Entonces, le damos la palabra a Panu y les voy a compartir yo las diapositivas. Gracias, Panu.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and invitation. Very glad to be participating in this seminar. Greetings from the Helsinki evening. It's autumn here. The evenings are getting dark, and I'm speaking from the east side of Helsinki. Pheno-agric people is the tradition here, so we are quite far in the north of Europe. We have our share of climate activism here. We have pretty good democracy, even though our current government is not exactly very good in climate politics. So this topic is relevant in many corners of the world, and I want to recognize that there will be many particularities in the Mexican situation that I'm not completely aware of. So I'm offering some international perspectives and looking forward for discussing how does this sound from your perspective. I've had the privilege of reading the excellent studies of Mexican climate activists and emotions by the organizers of this series, and that was one of the reasons why I was glad to come here. Next slide, please. This is a river in northern Finland. Southern parts of Finland have more forests, but this is really far in the north, near to the lands of the Sami people, the only indigenous people still actively living in Europe. This river is quite beautiful in many people's eyes. It's the home for many species, of course, and it has been very important for fishing also. And in addition to telling something about one corner of the land where I'm coming from, Finland, it also directly relates to the topic of climate change and emotions. Because of global warming, the salmon in the river have been affected. There has been an invasive species of salmon entering the river, and actually much of the fishing is now gone, leading to complex emotions of ecological grief, confusion, and others. And this is an example of how climate change can cause many kinds of impacts. Sometimes emotions about climate change are quite directly about the phenomenon itself, like worry about climate change in general, and sometimes they are emotions about the impacts of climate change, like in this case, the changes in the fish in the river and all the consequences of that. Next slide, please. This is the climate emotions wheel, a visualization of many emotions that people have been observed to feel in relation to climate matters. It was published in 2023 by an organization called Climate Mental Health Network. I was part of the working group. They found my research on climate emotions and used that quite a lot in the process. I was able to influence the end result to a certain degree, but not to every degree. And in psychology, emotion wheels have a long history. Robert Plutchik is one of the researchers who has done a quite wide-ranging and colorful emotion wheel. So this continues that tradition, but more specifically in relation to climate matters. I don't know if you have seen this before. If you put the next slide on, please. It has been translated also into Spanish and Portuguese and roughly 40 other languages, which has been a very nice thing. These kinds of visualizations are relatively simple, but they can help many people to reflect what they are feeling about certain issue, in this case climate change, and sometimes they can help people also to realize what other people are feeling. And this shouldn't be taken too literally. There's 4 segments in the middle, but it doesn't mean that all the emotions under a certain segment are some kind of sub-emotions of that particular emotion word. For example, guilt and shame are there under sadness, but they are emotions of their own. And then there's many different emotions in this quite vaguely titled positivity sector there on the upper right. So it is meant to give ideas, perhaps feelings also, but there would be many other emotions also, and the structure shouldn't be taken too hierarchically. In down and right, there are threat-related emotions, and in discussions about climate emotions, climate worry and anxiety have received a lot of attention. They are very closely related to the emotion of fear also. Some researchers propose that they form a kind of continuum or a spectrum of various kinds of intensities of threat-related emotions. And in that sector are also some words which describe kind of mental states, so like feeling overwhelmed or feeling a kind of panic. And then there could be a scholarly discussion about what counts as an emotion or feeling and what psychological phenomena are combinations of many things, but I'll not go into that now. But just to mention that people's emotions are complex. There can be many kinds of elements in our experiences, especially if we take a look at people's experiences over time. And in this presentation, I'm also going to speak a bit about my process model of ego, anxiety and grief, which is one attempt to do a simplified model of what may happen in people's journeys in relation to ecological awareness and also climate awareness. Down left, the segment of sadness includes many terms also, and this also reminds of how emotion terms are connected to different languages. And I guess you realize this very well because many of you speak Spanish. My native language is Finnish, that's part of the Finno-Ugric languages. And for example, in Finnish language, we don't separate between sadness and grief. We just use one word, suru, for both of them. And we have some emotion terms which are very handy, like riittämättömyyden tunne, that translates as feeling of not being and doing enough. So there is not an exact equivalent in English. Feeling inadequate would be quite close, but not exactly. And many people in Finland resonate with this riittämättömyyden tunne, this feeling of not being able to be and do enough in relation to climate matters. And in some empirical studies, we have noticed that many environmental activists often feel these kinds of feelings, even though they often are already doing a lot. So that's one of the practical challenges and psychological challenges, how to balance those feelings that am I doing enough and who can say when somebody is doing enough. So it's difficult to set the norms and balance doing and rest, for example. Then there are emotions related to anger and moral outrage. This term, moral outrage, in English is actually quite handy. We don't have an exact equivalent in Finnish language. I've sometimes discussed this with people from different countries, and it's quite interesting that what are the connotations of anger-related words. And in Finnish, for example, due to cultural reasons, there's often the idea that people shouldn't be angry. So there is an emotion norm quite widely shared in society that it's somehow problematic if people are angry in public. And if we go to other European countries like France, for example, or Italy or Spain, it's quite different. People are much more approving of showing anger in public also. And that's one practical example of cultural and national emotion norms. And these also affect climate emotions and activism. For example, in questions like, are climate activists allowed to show anger in public? And if so, in what ways? And very often emotion norms have gendered aspects. And one traditional part of this in industrialized countries has been that a good girl shouldn't be angry in public, which then often causes problems for a healthy relationship with anger in girls. And another example would be that a brave man never cries in public. So that's another distorted, gendered emotion norm. And in addition to research, I sometimes lead workshops, and I've met also many climate activists who suffer from these kind of gendered emotion norms because they can hinder that important connection to different kinds of emotional energies in people's body minds. And by the way, sorry for the translator if that was a bit technical. So, emotions have important messages to tell us. They include a lot of energy, and it's very important to be able to be in touch with them. In the upper right, there is these more quickly empowering emotions, and these are often felt in relation to actually doing something in relation to climate matters. So gratitude, for example, is often felt towards people who are trying to do better climate politics and taking climate action. Feelings of togetherness and camaraderie are often felt in activism in addition to difficult emotions, which may be due, for example, to social conflicts and sometimes oppression of climate activists. And that is, of course, something which shows in the studies of Mexican climate activists also, so I'll not go further there. Next slide, please. This is the research article which was much used behind the wheel toward a taxonomy of climate emotions. The first version didn't have the word taxonomy in the title, and I was also trying to discuss both the concept of emotion and feeling, but that got too complicated, especially in the opinion of the peer reviewers. So this is the sort of simplified version, and that includes many other emotions which are not mentioned in the wheel. So that's freely available online. Next slide, please. There is also this emoji version now available. Emojis, of course, can cause many interpretations of what is going on, as I think anyone who has sent and received emoji messages with their grandparents can easily affirm that sometimes one might receive different kinds of emojis than what one was expecting to receive. Some of these are quite descriptive of many climate emotions, and there on the right, on light green background, is a kind of semi-official climate anxiety emoji, which is smiling even though it's melting at the same time. So somebody has made a comment on the state of the world via that emoji. Next slide, please. This organization, Climate Mental Health Network, shares also other resources on their website, including this short guide to climate emotions, which I wrote together with the help of Anja Kamenets. So that is also available. And for example, an empty wheel exercise, which can be quite helpful so that people can use emotion words that they feel suitable. Next one, please. When we take a broader perspective, we are here talking about emotions, about the state of the world. And then there has been different proposals of what this broader category might be called. Some people have experimented with the term of polycrisis emotions. Polycrisis meaning how different crises are entangled. Some are talking about eco-social crises, but of course there's also other aspects. In social psychology, the terms of macro-social worries or macro worries are sometimes used, and Maria Ojala, who is joining this series, if all goes well later on, she's been using those in some of her writing. For example, global dread is one suggestion. The work that Reconnects Network is an example of NGO, non-governmental organization work where people's emotions about the world are engaged with a great variety of methods. Joanna Macy, Buddhist systems thinker and environmental activist, who died actually this year at a very high age of roughly 95 years, if I'm not mistaken. She was a major leader in that network, and my practical work also has been much influenced by her work and the colleagues working there. They use this expression, honoring our pain for the world, which I kind of like. I still think that it's useful to pay attention to different kinds of emotions and feelings, but also often the total experience can be something like pain about the state of the world. And there can be many causes of that. For example, policies and politics which include violence and that may have direct connections with climate matters or not. And anyway, all politics in the contemporary world are shaped by the climate crisis, but sometimes I think it's good to recognize that many kinds of troubles in the world affect people, and there is a sort of climate dimension or layer in those kinds of experiences. And for some people, and in sometimes, the climate dimension is the crucial one. And in that case, it's the clearest to talk about climate emotions. Next time, please. I will not speak now much about different, yes, you can put the text on text, about the different terms about affective phenomena in emotion research. There's lots of discussions and debates about this. What is most important, I think, is to recognize that there are different temporalities in affective phenomena. And in the work of Jasper and once again the Mexican climate activist articles, there's good discussion about also this temporality issue. There can be different levels of consciousness related to emotions. Sometimes we can more easily notice what we are feeling and sometimes not so easily. And of course, people can be educated and trained to be better in noticing emotions or combinations of them. And in relation to climate change, it may be a combination of both sadness and guilt for some people, and confusion and fear for some others, or a mix of these, and often anger and moral outrage, perhaps feelings of helplessness. So it's really a changing landscape of many emotional tones or colors, if we use those metaphors. And in more exact emotion research, different terms can be used to study this, like mood, for example. The concept of affect is quite complicated, as probably Blanche has already talked about, so it can be used in a variety of ways. I think that these elements of life which emotions are connected with are probably quite familiar to you, but I just wanted to include one slide about some quite basic things. So there's connections with behavior, also with attitudes and ethics. Sometimes the concept of moral emotions is used, and some emotions have received more attention than others under that framing. And it's a very important enterprise, I think, to also think about moral and ethical aspects of those emotions which are not always included in the list of moral emotions. And I would say that a growing number of scholars are pointing out that sadness or ecological grief or climate grief in this case has much connections with ethics and morality, and also potentially with politics. So that's one example. And emotions can be connected with well-being and functionality also. Once again, in many ways. If one is constantly worried and fearful, the effects on the nervous system in the long run will cause complications. Or if one becomes depressed for many reasons. But also if one's anger is just stuck inside oneself for a very long time, that is also going to have health effects, for example. And in my work, both in research and in public speaking, I have done most of that in Finland, but part of that also internationally. I have tried to defend a multifaceted view of eco-emotions and climate emotions, so that they shouldn't be restricted only to a therapeutic framework or discourse, or only to a pro-environmental behavior framework, for example, because it's such a complicated phenomenon, it can have many dimensions. And the relationship between cognition and emotion is complex. Our thoughts and our feelings influence each other. I'll just leave it there and ask for the next slide. Thanks. Yes, this is good. So I will not go deeply into this now. I just mentioned that Tara Grandon from Australia has done, together with colleagues, useful work in applying socio-ecological modeling to climate emotions, and in this case, climate anxiety. So it's useful to think about various factors which have an impact on people's climate emotions, starting from personal and micro levels, going to our social relations, and then extending to what is going on in the places and regions and countries in which we are living. So there's many kinds of factors which have an effect. And you can put the next slide, please. And this is the reference for that article if somebody wants to take a look. And there's also some more recent research and writing by Grandon and colleagues which deals with these issues. You can find that online. Next one, please. I didn't include a lot of bibliographical references in these slides. This one I did. It's a relatively new book about the philosophy of environmental emotions, or some of them. I wrote some concluding reflections there. There is one quite nice chapter on different objects of climate emotions in that book, for example. So it's an example of how the discussions are broadening around the topic. Next one, please. I also didn't include much statistical numbers in this presentation. This is the large international survey I was doing with colleagues in 2021 about climate emotions among young people in 10 countries worldwide. So there was online surveys of 1,000 young people in 10 different countries, and also questions about how they perceive the climate politics of the governments of the world. And the results showed that climate emotions are felt by young people worldwide, and if the direct climate impacts are more severe, that correlates with stronger difficult climate emotions. And in general, young people are very frustrated, angry, and feeling betrayed about the state of climate politics by the world governments. So those numbers were very high in 2021. My guess would be that if this survey was done now, even more young people would be saying that they are disappointed about the state of climate politics at the moment. But that, of course, remains to be seen. But those results are also found openly online. Next one, please. I'll briefly mention a couple of empirical articles I've been doing with colleagues. So starting from below, Isabel Coppola is a young American scholar who interviewed young climate and environmental activists first in the States and then later in Finland as part of her Fulbright exchange year. And we wrote a paper on how these young environmentally active people see the role of climate emotions in their lives. There would be data also about coping and emotion regulation by these people, and the same applies to the article up here by Johannes Kearns and me about Western Buddhist climate activists. So that's a sort of special group which has been quite active in Extinction Rebellion, for example, in many countries, and bringing a sort of different kind of mindfulness-based type of activism into street activism, for example. And it was quite interesting how they tried to balance between the Buddhist religious tradition and lessons they had learned in activism. For example, from Buddhism, they had learned that one shouldn't be angry, but in activism, they had observed that, well, very often anger can be useful in activism if it's channeled in constructive ways and doesn't become too violent, for example. So there was these negotiations between different influences and norms in their lives. And also from that data, we would have the stuff for another paper on coping and emotion regulation, and hopefully we sometime get there in addition to other work. Next one, please. So observations about objects of emotions in the terrain of climate emotions. They can be about the climate crisis in totality, as I mentioned. Also about how other people react or don't react in relation to climate matters. And there can be even more explicit emotions about activism. And this latter category was much present among those people we discussed in the articles mentioned in the previous slides. And it's a, how should I say, complex process of back and forth between the rest of society and activism. And so activists react to expectations coming from other people, and they also have some of their expectations of their own, and it's a many directional process what happens. Next one, please. And some of the needs include regulating emotions to maintain activist well-being, and this can take many forms. It can be related to threat-related emotions, but also, for example, in relation to sadness or anger. And there can be times when one sort of feels a need to down-regulate the emotional energy to serve some practical need. And this already links with the second point in this slide about regulating emotions in order to perform tasks in activism. And sometimes people can upregulate the emotional energy, for example, pumping up some moral outrage to build determination before a climate street demonstration, to mention one example. So there can be many dimensions again in relation to these needs. Next one, please. I will not speak a lot about ecological grief and sorrow today, but I'll just mention that I have been working heavily with that topic over the last years. And this title, Ecological Sorrow, is from one large paper I did on the topic. And it deals with types of loss and grief in relation to ecological and climate matters. This term, disenfranchised grief, comes from grief and bereavement research. There is a Spanish translation of this image actually also that can be found on the website of Climate Mental Health Network. I can't remember now what it was in Spanish, but this means grief which is not socially supported. So there's maybe different kinds of problems in others not recognizing or validating the grief. And I included this here because this is something that many climate activists feel, that others don't recognize how much sorrow and grief climate change is producing, and then the end result is disenfranchised grief. Sometimes it can be even worse, and even in two recent papers I've done together with philosopher Elisa Aaltola, who is a very ardent animal rights activist and a moral philosopher. We are discussing emotions of sadness related to the treatment of non-human animals. And that's another topic which is close to Blanche Worley's heart, for example. And there sometimes there can be contradictory feelings about a single event. For example, a hunter is rejoicing of having shot an animal, and then another person who really appreciates that animal is feeling sadness and moral outrage because of what has happened. So it can be contradictory, and we call that contrapuntal grief. So contrapuntal referring to this opposite distance between the emotional experiences. And contested grief would be another way to describe this. Next one, please. So this is the graphical abstract of that ecological sorrow paper. Thanks to Santtu Oja, a Finnish graphic designer who works with me in doing these images. And I just mentioned this, that if you want to return to types of loss and grief and think about how they may be relevant also in relation to climate activists, that's a possibility, but I'll not go further now to this. We can go to the next one. And this as another image of Finland that used to be an old growth forest, but then for dubious reasons it was clear-cut by state officials in 2015. Many people got outraged because of that, even though Finns are slow to outrage. Sometimes even we manage to reach that state. Also myself, I organized a kind of funeral for the old growth forest, which is related to this element of sorrow in environmental activism. And my own opinion is that at best there would be safe spaces for engaging with ecological grief, and those are not so politically contested or open spaces. And then there can be elements of ecological grief engagement as part of, for example, street activism. And that has happened often with Extinction Rebellion, for example. But then that's not exactly safe. It may be contested in many ways, and it's problematic to go into deeper vulnerability in relation to grief if you are at the same time doing street activism. So I think there should be different kinds of spaces and places for engagement with that quite important dimension. We can go to the next slide, please. And since the topic of ritual came up here, I'll also mention a paper from last year, which is about engaging with climate grief, guilt, and anger in religious communities. So I was combining some of my earlier research themes with the climate emotion research and observing that in different religions there may be different strengths and challenges in relation to various climate emotions. And I already mentioned that anger can be challenging in Buddhism and very much so also in Christianity. In Protestant Christianity and Roman Catholicism there has been much engagement with guilt and sometimes also with environmental guilt. One can take critical analysis of the dynamics of that, of course. So there can be sort of different needs for other kinds of engagement in different religious communities. And once again, this is just to mention for those of you who want to take a further look later on. We can go forward, please. And then we come to this process model, which I wanted to briefly also discuss here. And I know that time is running, so I'll try to be relatively short, but also understandable, and then the organizers can cut me off if I go too long here. So this is the result of a long research process where I wanted to do a model of engaging with the severity of the ecological crisis, a model which would be simple enough that it can be used in various places, but also more nuanced than 5 stages of grief type of models, which were more prevalent during 2020 when I started doing this. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's a saying from my dear podcast colleague, Dr. Doherty, and this is the spirit here also. There's chronological stages from left to right, unknowing, so not knowing about the severity of the ecological and climate crisis, and then semi-consciousness. And this semi-consciousness is quite complex indeed because it includes situations where people know something but not very much. So that is relatively simple. But then there can be situations where people sort of know, but they wouldn't like to know. They may, for example, have the intuition that if they accept this climate change information, that would actually require them to change some of their life ways and their political opinions, and that might have consequences for their social relations also. So it can be quite tricky when social support is not available for climate awareness and action. Many people, there's awakenings happening which result in shocks, at least sometimes moral shocks. There may be other kinds too. And then we come to the heart of the model, which is called coping and changing, with the aim of adaptation and transformation. So in the article where this is, I'm actually discussing some of Blanche's work on affective adaptation, for example. So in the middle, coping and changing, complex dynamics are simplified into 3 dimensions and a background space, with the idea that even though people are different and contexts are different, everybody seems to need some elements from the 3 dimensions in order to adjust and transform. So action is needed, of course, for the planet, but also for feelings of efficacy and feeling some kind of empowerment in contrast to powerlessness, that feeling that at least I can do something in an effort to make things better. And that again helps with distress, for example. But not everybody has equal access to various kinds of action, so we need to be careful here that there is not just one normative idea of what counts as action. Then, because there are many changes and losses, there would be the need also to engage with sadness and grief, and that's why grieving is another dimension here, including other emotional engagement. And even the typical processes of grief which are studied, namely the loss of another human person, those often include negotiations of guilt and different kinds of anger, for example. And that applies also to ecological grief. And then thirdly, there is the dimension of distancing, which can include both self-care and avoidance. And some people have been calling this healthy denial, but I prefer the word distancing here. But anyway, the human nervous system can't be in touch with trouble 24/7, or otherwise it just becomes too much for us. People have various kinds of levels of resistance, and there can be strong toughness, but we all need some rest and some distancing also. And once again, there's lots of intersectional factors affecting the possibilities for rest and self-care naturally. And so that would be needed. And the dynamic here is also that if a person or a group does one of these 3 dimensions overly strongly, then there is a greater danger of ending up to this background space of stronger anxiety or depression or burnout. A typical example from the workshops I've been leading in Finland and States would be a young climate activist who has done so much that they are at the verge of burnout. And because there is so much to do, it's very easy to do too much, especially because decision makers are not doing enough. And it's much up to the community, for example, the activist organization, to set up norms which would support also rest. And some of the new environmental and climate activist organizations are actually very good at this. This is often, in my experience, more challenging for older environmental organizations because this hasn't been part of their work and life. It's difficult to start speaking about ecological grief, for example, if you have worked for 30 years at a nature conservation organization and the topic has never been talked about in public. And that's a practical example from Finland also. It's not impossible, but it takes quite a lot to get there. And distancing, if one just practices distancing, there's going to be cognitive dissonance, so the word and your actions and beliefs are not in sync. There's going to be dissonance and distress also because of that. So a sort of balancing would be needed. And the second circle in the process model describes a state where people have been able to find more balance and more consciousness of moving between the dimensions. And one of my most recent articles is engaging with the process model of eco-anxiety in group work, which is based on some practical workshops I facilitated where we also physically moved between the dimensions. So in a space, a bit like psychodrama, we had papers depicting the different dimensions and we were sharing and experimenting with movement between the dimensions. So that's just one brief mention of how somatic movement may be integrated in workshops about these issues. Next slide, please. And I'll finish very soon. I just mentioned that there is a website put together with the generous funding from a Finnish foundation, my Tornesting Foundation, where we produced videos about the process model. So there is a 3-minute animation done by Spotted Fawn, a Canadian indigenous-based production company, and a 50-minute discussion video teaching climate together, which is hosted by Isaias Hernandez, who some of you may know. He operates in social media with the name Queer Brown Vegan and has been doing much to promote Latino perspectives on environmentalism in the United States and beyond. So if you click the next slide please. There is just a brief description of the videos that were produced. So the animation is called The Dance Living with Eco-Anxiety. And if you click once more, there's the other video. And if you click once more, there is a forthcoming third one, which is a documentary of how young people are coping or not coping with climate emotions. So those resources are found online, as well as the podcast, which is on the next slide. I was glad to hear that Blanche also mentioned it. And with that, I'm coming to the closing of this presentation. I hope this has given some ideas about the wide variety of climate emotions and the complex dynamics about them. There's always much more to say than what can be done in 45 minutes, even though that is a nicely generous time for a keynote. I hate those 15-minute conference presentations where it's so difficult to get any depth to the things. So thanks for the attention so far, and really looking forward to discussing this briefly with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Panu. Voy. Muchas gracias, Panu. La presentación fue muy completa y creo que nos ayuda mucho a mostrar la importancia de estudiar las emociones vinculadas con la crisis climática y además, como tú mencionabas, en distintos contextos sociales y culturales. En México sabemos poco de las emociones climáticas. Hemos empezado en estos años a estudiar las emociones con activistas y en este momento estamos empezando a trabajar con población no activista. Pero tu trabajo es muy útil porque nos guía ¿no? Para entender cómo se están construyendo las emociones vinculadas con estas policrisis, como tú las mencionaste, en un contexto como México. Y muy brevemente, México es un país desigual, con mucha violencia, mucha represión hacia las y los defensores. Esto influye en las emociones que se sienten. Y una pregunta conclusiva, como un último comentario, reflexión de tu parte, podría ser, por ejemplo, si has visto en tu mismo país, Finlandia, diferencias en la construcción de emociones en distintas clases sociales o con, por ejemplo, los indígenas Sami comparado con la población en ciudades, ¿no? En zonas urbanas. Que sí nosotros estamos viendo diferencias, algunas diferencias más nacionales por el contexto mexicano, pero otras muy locales también. Entonces, ¿tú también estás observando, has observado estas diferencias?
Hmm. Yes, first of all, thank you for that feedback, much appreciated, and very much looking forward for future studies from Mexico also. And some reflections on this very good question. The Sami people in northern parts of Finland and Scandinavia, they started feeling sort of slightly confused and disoriented because of weather and climate changes already some decades ago, because many of them practice reindeer herding and they live in close connections with winter and snow, so they started observing the changes before many of the urban populations did. And I have had talks with several Sami climate activists, and we understand each other despite the differences, because there is the emphasis on the importance of the modern human world. But of course, for Sami people, there are the differences because, for example, the Finnish government still hasn't recognized some land ownership issues related to some Sami people, and international mining companies would like to set up more mines in those territories. That applies also to other parts of Finland. And then there is what some critics have been calling green colonialism, meaning that because of climate change, there's the need for more renewable energy, and then some of those great windmill parks, for example, are planned for ancient Sami reindeer herding territory, or some of their sacred hills, for example. So we have those elements in north of Finland also. For urban people, I think that climate emotions can be more prominent than the broader category of eco-emotions, even though I'm including climate emotions under eco-emotions, because regardless of how strong their nature connection is, they may be worried about the effects of climate change on the urban settings. So sometimes that may be a sort of joining factor. And we have to remember that also in cities there may be people who have strong environmental values and who like to go to nature places when they have the chance. It may be just different how often they get to do it. But on average, of course, there are differences. It's also very complex in relation to who recognizes climate emotions and who is sort of able to talk about them. I have met many people in Finland, for example, men from rural areas who they say that no, I don't feel much climate emotions at all. But when you discuss with them, it becomes evident that they are worried about climate change in many ways, and they are trying to negotiate levels of guilt, for example, and that may lead them to sort of do some aggressive, that no, don't come here telling us that we should change our life ways because of climate emissions, for example. So I really think that interview methods and observations are quite important in this kind of research, because in surveys we don't get the full reality because of the complications here. I just mentioned a brief detail that in a Finnish national survey of climate emotions in 2019, young people reported much more climate guilt and shame than older people. But I don't think that it's really that situation, but just the older people, for them it's so difficult to be in touch with guilt and shame that they just say that no, I don't feel it, even though it may be in them. So once again, quite complex issues, and my view is that there is more climate emotions in people who don't report them. But of course, that then requires careful research so that it doesn't sound like the researcher is a besserwisser, a person who knows it all, that even though those people are saying that they don't know, but I know type of thing. So it's a good combination of humility and determination might be needed.
Sí, totalmente de acuerdo. Una pregunta del público antes que te vayas. ¿Si has explorado o identificado emociones asociadas a la criminalización o el desgaste emocional en activistas ambientales en Finlandia?
Thank you for raising that up. And actually, from January to April next year, I will be working in a project with the Finnish Youth Research Society, which takes a look especially at this. So we are going to interview young Finnish climate activists who have had troubles with the police. And also in Finland, there is this sort of movement towards more criminalization of non-violent civil disobedience. So next year I will know more, and I'm encouraging people to be in touch over email. Well, I get a lot of email, but I'm always interested to hear about new research and discuss matters.
Sí, muchas gracias, Panu. De hecho, esperamos ver los resultados de tu investigación, porque como sabes, en México hay mucha represión, entonces las emociones que nosotros trabajamos están muy vinculadas con esas emociones que nacen de la represión, de la violencia, pero a veces no se conoce cómo se viven esas emociones en otros contextos o si se dan. Entonces, será muy interesante poder comparar las emociones de activistas climáticos en distintos contextos, visibilizando hasta las emociones que quizás no se hablan a menudo, ¿no? Como las emociones vinculadas con la represión en el norte global, que no son tan evidentes como pasa en el sur, por ejemplo.
Mm-hmm.
Y nosotros esperamos también comparar nuestras investigaciones con población no activista e indígenas también aquí en México sobre emociones climáticas. Se sabe muy poco, pero empezamos a tener resultados y será muy interesante seguir pudiéndonos alimentar y enriquecer recíprocamente del trabajo que estamos haciendo y por supuesto también de las herramientas que tú estás desarrollando prácticas para trabajar con la gente que son tan necesarias y que también esperamos, digamos, adaptar o enriquecer de este lado del mundo.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much for that, and really looking forward to discussing that more in the future, and also feeling gratitude and togetherness about these initiatives and about all people who care. So I wanted to also to recognize that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Entonces, dejamos concluida esta conferencia y dejamos libre a Panu para que pueda ir a cenar, ya que es ya más tarde allá en Finlandia. Gracias, Panu.
Gracias, Panu.